So yeah, like Jade mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about what we can sort of learn from the fossil record of really, really old amphibians from Antarctica and what this tells us about broader ecological and environmental changes that are going on at the time. And in the particular context that I want to talk about today, we're going to be thinking about the recovery from what's conceived of as Earth's greatest mass extinction. And so historically, paleontologists have sort of classified what we call the Big Five mass extinction events. Um, and these are well recognized in the fossil record. We see a lot of biotic turnover. There's typically a lot of, for example, geological and geochemical evidence indicating that there's pronounced global environmental perturbations.
Recording in
And you can
progress.
measure these in a number of different ways, whether you're looking at, for example, extinction rate or the total number of species or genera that are lost. And typically the one that people have considered the most severe in terms of the total loss of biodiversity has been the one that occurs at the end of the Permian, which is sometimes alternatively referred to as the Permo-Triassic mass extinction event, but I'll refer to it as the end Permian mass extinction event here since it happens essentially at the end of the Permian. And this is not the fastest or the most abrupt of these mass extinctions that we recognize in the fossil record, but it's generally perceived, based on what we know from the fossil record, both marine and terrestrial records, to be the most severe in terms of the loss of biodiversity. And relative to the other mass extinctions that we observe in the fossil record, it also seems to be relatively protracted compared to, say, the end Cretaceous mass extinction event, where you have a very clear singular catastrophic event that then triggers a series of ripple effects that could persist for a fairly substantial amount of time. It seems that the end Permian mass extinction is a much more drawn out, sort of broad scale environmental gradual changes that build up to very unfavorable conditions across most of the planet. And so it takes a long time to kind of build up to that, and then a fairly long time to recover from that as well. The causes of the end Permian mass extinction are debated. There's a fair number of papers every year that come out in very notable journals with new evidence based on perhaps new data from a certain geographic region. But it's clear that there's a multiplicity of effects and causes that are going on here. Mass volcanism, as has been implicated in a number of other mass extinctions, is fairly well agreed upon to be at least one of the major drivers that we see for this. And in this case, one of the sort of downstream effects of having mass volcanism is excessive emissions of greenhouse gases, which can then lead to global warming, in which case we have a really, really good record for evidence of really substantial increases in temperature, frequently exceeding what we estimate to be in excess of 10 degrees Celsius. And so you can imagine, for example, if temperatures on average increase by 10 degrees Celsius, that would be quite extreme for a lot of organisms, including people, right, who can certainly be climatically adapted for different sorts of areas. I grew up in Southern California, so I'm very used to very hot climates, but not to very cold climates. And so these really very pronounced changes in temperature, for example, as well as other factors such as precipitation, ocean acidification. There's a whole lot of different factors that can be correlated with a really broad scale pattern of events such as mass volcanism. And so this is also one of the reasons why a lot of people who are sort of looking to the geologic past for proxies in terms of how we can understand contemporary climate change and the relatively rapid increase in temperature and the sort of related changes that we see in terms of environmental degradation and habitat loss and the effects on biodiversity, we'll look to, for example, the end Permian mass extinction, among others, to kind of get an idea of what can we get in, can we learn about how life has previously responded to these, global scale perturbations. The end Permian mass extinction, like pretty much all other mass extinctions, triggers a really pronounced faunal turnover. And so if we're in sort of the late Permian, right before this extinction event, we have an assemblage that's really dominated by synapsids. And these are essentially the forerunners of mammals. They don't look like mammals at this point, and they lack most of the features that we would associate with mammals. It's not clear, for example, that they have fur. But these are typically the apex predators in a lot of environments, as well as being really common herbivores. And so most of the assemblages around the world that we know of are really dominated by synapsids. As we go through this extinction event and then reach the Triassic period, synapsids definitely persist. We obviously still have mammals. We are mammals today. But the assemblages become much more dominated by reptiles. And this then leads into the age of the dinosaurs, beginning in sort of the late Triassic and then really ramping up into the Jurassic and the Cretaceous before the dinosaurs then go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. And so, we see all these mass extinction events that are essentially reorganizing the ecosystems by wiping out most of the organisms and creating a lot of vacant ecological space in which the survivors can radiate into, and there can be a lot of sort of experimentation of sort of novel forms and novel ecologies. And this can be a really good opportunity for a lot of organisms that do end up making it through those mass extinction events. But the question, I think, really that people are very interested in, whether you're a paleontologist only interested in understanding deep time narratives, or you're a modern biologist trying to understand how can we understand contemporary patterns, is thinking about what happens in an extinction event, right? Why do certain organisms survive and other organisms do not, right? And this has, of course, been a really major interest to different groups because, for example, we want to understand why the dinosaurs go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, but crocodiles, other large reptiles, survive and actually end up thriving. And so for the end Permian, we're really interested in understanding how these forerunners of a lot of modern groups, not just synapsids that lead to mammals, but also the archosaurs that eventually end up taking over. These lead to include crocodiles and dinosaurs, amphibians, all sorts of other reptiles, various groups of fishes like sharks, for example. We want to understand why certain groups end up surviving and others do not. And so one of the hypotheses has been that most of the planet became globally relatively inhospitable during these sort of events of end Permian mass extinction, but that at probably a peripheral location, essentially they're sort of sheltered from these effects by virtue of being relatively high latitude. And so you might think today, for example, global warming does affect all regions of the planet, right? People are probably familiar with many of those videos of giant ice sheets from Antarctica calving off, or icebergs just breaking off and melting. But it's quite obvious, for example, that if you think about a modern area like the Sahara Desert, which is already quite inhospitable, if that gets a little bit hotter, it's not really going to change that much. But if certain regions that are not like the Sahara Desert all of a sudden become conditioned like the Sahara Desert, that could wipe out a lot of space, geographically speaking, in environments in which organisms that previously existed there are now no longer able to exist. And so typically the responses that you see from organisms, especially when it comes to instances like global warming, is they're going to start following essentially the climate trends and seeking out the same climate pattern that they used to thrive in, if that occurred, wherever that occurs. And typically in global warming, that would be either a higher elevation. So if it starts getting warm at the base of a mountain, you start moving up the mountain, and this is what you can see in trees, for example. Or if you're a more mobile organism, and let's say the equatorial region starts getting really hot, you might start moving up to higher latitudes where the temperatures are relatively cooler. And so in thinking about how Earth is configured, 252 million years ago at the end of the Permian, right, we have the supercontinent Pangaea. So it's relatively connected, fairly easy for organisms, hypothetically speaking, to traverse broad distances in order to sort of seek out optimal habitats. And so the notion has been that probably there's some sort of refugium at a high latitude. And just to give an idea of where Nova Scotia is, it's the red star. So again, just a good reminder, of course, that some places are situated very differently than they are today. Antarctica and at the end of the Permian is actually still pretty close to the South Pole, but other regions are much closer or farther than the equator than they are today. And so this notion of like a high latitude refugium has really been kicked around a lot because it makes conceptual sense, right? If we have really pronounced global warming, the interior of the continents in particular tends to become really uninhabitable because there's not a whole lot of precipitation because it's so separated from the ocean or other large bodies of water. As a result, it becomes really dry, arid, and hot, and that's not good for plants. It's not good for animals. And so there's definitely I think a very good argument to be made that much of what's now Northern Africa and probably what's much of now North America was not really super habitable at the time of the end Permian mass extinction and the events related to it. But it's possible that these areas at higher latitudes would have been more hospitable. And so you might look to the southern hemisphere, for example, where you have regions like India, Madagascar, Australia, Antarctica, and bits of South America and Africa. There's much more land mass down there in the southern hemisphere than there is at the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, in which case it's pretty much only parts of Russia at this point that are really above that high latitudinal range. And previous workers have really conjectured, perhaps, that in thinking about amphibians specifically, trying to understand how these climatically sensitive organisms, which I'll come back to in a couple slides, survive this is thinking about, okay, where exactly would this be? And so some people have actually suggested specifically Antarctica. But one of the challenges to this, of course, is that Antarctica is not very accessible to get to. It's very difficult to do fieldwork down there. And so it's much more difficult to get an established fossil record from which you can make really good testable hypotheses and then actually test them, compared to regions that have been more historically explored and that are historically much easier to access, such as South Africa. And so there's a number of really productive geographic basins that record early Triassic, so post-extinction interval tetrapods at what would have been high latitudes in southern Pangaea. And so I've marked up a couple of them here, going from left to right. We have Brazil, South Africa, Madagascar, Antarctica, India, and Australia. And all of these would have been situated at relatively high latitudes. Some of them still are today, some of them are not. But these all have sort of different records, both in terms of which animals and plants and other organisms they preserve, as well as the relative completeness and the relative abundance of their different organisms. A lot of what we know about the end Permian mass extinction, both on the Permian side of things, as well as in that post-extinction recovery interval in the early Triassic, comes from South Africa, where there are easily tens of thousands of fossils known from these intervals, because collection has been going on for well over 150 years. And so the deposits from the Karoo Basin in South Africa are some of the best known deposits for late Permian and early Triassic tetrapods. And we have a really, really good record of this. And so the obvious question is, is South Africa that refugium, either for amphibians or for tetrapods at large? And this is really, I think, where the nuance comes in, which is, first of all, that different organisms have different optimal conditions, right? We might think, for example, about the difference between modern reptiles like lizards and amphibians. Your average modern amphibian likes it warm, but not hot. Your average lizard likes it really hot, which is why, for example, if you keep pet lizards, you see them in a museum or a zoo, the lizards usually have it cranked up to about 40 degrees Celsius or higher, whereas the amphibians are pretty content around 25. So it's possible that for certain groups, South Africa is a really habitable place, but we actually have a really good record of the amphibian fossils, enough to know that South Africa has very, very few amphibian fossils in the late Permian and then trending into the early Triassic. And so this really indicates that South Africa, despite clearly it being habitable by a diverse range of organisms, is not so good for amphibians, either before the mass extinction event or really in that immediate recovery interval. And so South Africa is very unlikely to be the refugium, even though it seems to have been capable of supporting some amphibian diversity. And so we're really kind of left looking at these other adjacent geographic regions, which are historically much less well sampled. There's far fewer fossils. We know far less about the diversity and the overall community structure. And so I want to turn briefly to, I suppose, sort of the subject of the talk, which is thinking about amphibians and why amphibians, beyond the fact that that's just what I sort of happen to study. I think that broadly speaking, regardless of whether you like amphibians or find them interesting or don't like them at all, amphibians are a really important part of understanding terrestrial ecosystems because they serve as a really good sort of barometer for environmental conditions. In a lot of cases in the fossil record, we don't necessarily have all the information or data available to derive really precise paleoenvironmental interpretations. But knowing sort of the physiological and life history attributes of modern amphibians, which we then infer backwards onto their ancestors, we're able to sort of make some reasonable inferences and conjectures about sort of what environments might have been like or weren't like, depending on whether there's any fossil amphibians found there. And if so, how diverse are they? How big do they get? What sort of ecologies do we think they have? And of course, this is a really important talking point in contemporary conservation biology and ecology, and thinking about how modern amphibians are sort of canaries in the coal mine, but in an aquatic setting, right? That when water quality, for example, gets very poor, it tends to affect amphibians. If water habitats are sort of depleted, it tends to affect amphibians. But the amphibians that I'm going to be talking about today look nothing like modern amphibians. And so this refers to, what I'm going to be talking about today refers to a group known as temnospondyls, and this is the group that my research primarily focuses on. And a lot of these, by and large, look nothing, absolutely nothing like modern amphibians. They're much larger. Many of them could exceed 2 or 3 meters in body length. They display a number of unique features that you might associate with other types of animals. For example, the ones on the left look a lot like crocodiles, but they actually evolved this body plan tens of millions of years before crocodilians ever arrive on the scene. So there's been a number of really interesting things that amphibians, as some of the earliest tetrapods to get on land, have done over their really, really deep evolutionary history. And so what we see today in the modern record of amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and caecilians, is a very, very narrow range of what their total diversity and morphologically, ecologically once was. Certainly, if we look at the geologic past in many different environments, it's pretty clear that the amphibians are probably the apex predators, whereas in pretty much no instance in North America would you ever be concerned, for example, about going swimming in a lake and being eaten by an amphibian, right? That's something that maybe if you went to Florida, you might think you might get eaten by an alligator, but this is not a concern with modern amphibians. Tempest models are very different, much, much larger, much more morphologically diverse, and as a result, much more ecologically diverse. Now, tempest models are around for a really long time. And so they appear about 330-ish million years ago, and they make it all the way until about 125 million years ago. So it's over 200 million years that they're around, which is a lot longer than a lot of other extinct groups, notwithstanding the fact that they eventually give rise to modern amphibians. And so you don't need to worry too much about the specificities of the names, but showing this sort of time calibration, what I want folks to kind of take away is that if we really focus in on this end Permian mass extinction at this turnover event, we really see some interesting patterns, right? We lose certain groups that were present throughout much of the Paleozoic, the Permian and the Carboniferous, and we get the first records of a lot of groups in the earliest Triassic that we've never seen before in the fossil record. And so this indicates a really robust recovery from this extinction event, in which there's a lot of ecological space that's opened up. And now these survivors are able to take advantage of that and occupy a lot of different niches and ecologies. Some of these end up being successful in the long term, and they end up working out for, let's say, the rest of the Triassic, and some of them don't end up being so successful, and they kind of peter out after the early Triassic. But it's really, I think, a very good case study in understanding how, when life gives you lemons, right, you make lemonade. And so certainly when we think about the recovery from, broadly speaking, from the end Permian mass extinction event, it seems like despite being historically thought of as much more environmentally and climatically sensitive than, say, reptiles, for example, amphibians actually end up doing quite well. But it really raises the questions essentially of what allows them to survive, and is that some sort of physiological adaptation? Is that sheer dumb luck? Is it being in the right place at the right time, or conversely not being in the wrong place at the wrong time? And really brings us back to this question of, okay, where is like a possible refugium or sort of favorable area in which these amphibians could have kind of rode out the storm, potentially for a fairly good number of millions of years. And then subsequently, after climatic conditions began to sort of stabilize globally, we're able to kind of go out and repopulate the globe, because they then achieve essentially global distribution within the early Triassic, including, for example, all the way up to those really far northern hemisphere occurrences in Russia. And so that brings me to really the focus of today's talk, which is thinking about, okay, what is the Tempest model record of Antarctica, and how does that kind of inform us about the specificities of some of this extinction? So a couple terms. So in Antarctica, all of the Triassic rocks occur within what's called the Freemouth Formation. There are 3 informal intervals within the Freemouth Formation: lower, middle, and upper. As you can see, it's historically been well correlated. The lower Freemouth is equivalent to early Triassic in age, that the upper is a middle Triassic in age. And historically, we've had basically no fossils from the middle Freemouth, so it's been very difficult to make any sort of inferences about whether it represents an extension of the early Triassic or an extension of the middle Triassic. And I'll touch on that sort of towards the end of the talk. So I'm talking about a lot of stuff that was collected in the last couple of years, not by me, but by my postdoc advisor, Chris Cedor, and a number of other researchers who actually like cold places and thus would not die if they went to Antarctica. But amphibian fossils have been known from Antarctica for a really long time. In fact, the first fossils of tetrapods collected from Antarctica are actually Tempest models. So this is a lower jaw fragment that was collected in the 1960s, and it's the first fossil that was ever collected of a tetrapod in Antarctica. It's not, perhaps the most glamorous. It's certainly not complete at all, but it gave us, it's really sort of this first tantalizing glimpse that, as we know for other time points in Antarctica now, as well as other regions that today are not very habitable, these regions could have been much more habitable in the geologic past. And certainly Antarctica, if we think about it, despite being at the South Pole, both presently and at the end of the Permian, because the climate is warming up so much at the end of the Permian, it deglaciates essentially the entire globe. And so there's no ice anywhere. And so this makes it actually quite nice because it's relatively high latitude. So it's not going to be super hot like at the equatorial regions, but it's also not so cold. And so it's not glaciated as far as we can tell. And this makes it quite amenable for a lot of different organisms, not just the temnospondyls. But the problem with the historic record of amphibian temnospondyl fossils from Antarctica is they're really, really fragmentary. And a lot of this owes to the fact that it's not very easy to find fossils in Antarctica. There's very extreme weathering conditions, as you might imagine, down there. And so a lot of the early fossils of both temnospondyls and other tetrapods are really, really fragmentary. And it's really only, for example, because temnospondyl fossils often have a very distinctive pitting ornamentation on them that you can see in some of these images, that you're able to identify them really as temnospondyls at all. A lot of the fragments that were collected in the 60s and 70s are just indeterminate tetrapods. We don't really actually know, can't refine it any further. And it takes a lot of time to prepare this stuff. The matrix is really hard compared to the bone. And so there's a lot of technical difficulties, whether you're talking about the collection aspect to the preparation aspect, and then to the study of things that are in most cases, really quite fragmentary. And so, in sort of this initial spurt of Antarctic vertebrate paleontology research, people thought, okay, we have like a decent idea of what the fossil record of Antarctica is and how this compares to other regions from southern Pangaea and what this tells us about the recovery from the extinction. You can see particularly that in the lower Freemouths, this early Triassic recovery interval, originally people thought, oh, we have like a fairly good diversity of a number of different clades of different sizes, different morphologies. We feel pretty good about this. This looks a lot like, for example, South Africa. The problem with this is that it's very obvious that there was a lot of sort of circular logic applied to this, that people said, well, we find this in South Africa, so it must occur in Antarctica. And then they find something sort of fragmentary. It is not super diagnostic. It's not complete. They go, yeah, it kind of looks like this thing in South Africa. It must be this group. It's probably not that surprising that as we've come sort of, another couple decades since then, we have a much better idea in general of just the anatomy and the relationships of these different organisms, how to identify things, what are distinctive features, what are not distinctive features. Basically, all of these have been called into question. And so people have gone back and kind of looked at things and said, no, you would like this feature that they use to say that, oh, this is a Lydecarynid. That's actually a feature found in like all of these taxa, not just Lydecarynids, for example. And so it's really been a lot of undoing of that work in respects and being, I suppose, a little bit more critical and a little bit more rigorous in how we make these identifications and think about things. But this obviously creates a big problem because it makes it very challenging for us to tackle these bigger scale questions about, what does a broad recovery from extinction event look like? What is the diversity of temnospondyls and other tetrapods in Antarctica if we have a lot of uncertainty about what are these fossils actually? So we don't know really as much about the early Triassic of Antarctica as we would like, and this doesn't allow us to really test any hypotheses about a refugium, and is Antarctica that refugium, and if so, what allows it to be a refugium? So in the early sort of 2000s and 2010s, there was a lot of work that was done in the upper Freemouth. And so this collected a lot of really, really large, iconic temnospondyls, particularly a group known as Capitosaurs. And there's actually some Middle Triassic Capitosaurs from Nova Scotia in the Bay of Fundy as well. Really, really fragmentary stuff, not as complete as this, but there is some stuff up there as well. And this is great. I mean, this is, again, very cool to have Antarctic fossils, but ultimately what most people are more interested in is not really this Middle Triassic, when we know that global conditions have really stabilized and we begin to see, like a real flourishing of all sorts of tetrapod groups. We're not really in the extinction recovery interval at this point. We really want to know more about what's going on in this immediate aftermath of this extinction event, and what can that tell us, and what can, in this case, the temnospondyls really tell us. And I think one of the points that I want to emphasize here that I'll bring up again throughout this talk is that in a number of geographic regions, including Antarctica, temnospondyl fossils are a disproportionate amount of the total vertebrate tetrapod material that's been collected. It's not as extreme as certain regions like Australia, where 90% of the early Triassic tetrapods are temnospondyls, but about 40–50% of all the identifiable tetrapod remains from Antarctica, specifically in the lower Freemouth formation, are temnospondyls. And so I think this is also one reason why amphibians in a broad sense and temnospondyls in the specific sense can be a really good avenue for trying to tease out parts of extinction recovery and paleoclimate, because in some instances they're most of the fossil record. And so we kind of have to work with that because we may not have that much of other groups for any number of reasons. And this brings me to what I did really for the last 2.5 years for my postdoc work in sort of looking at some of these historic records, trying to tease out what can we actually say about these historic specimens, and then a lot of new material that was collected in the last couple of years. And what do those tell us? And there's a number of different narratives here that will kind of emerge. So the first thing that I kind of want to jump into is, I've highlighted sort of the major trends that occur across this mass extinction event, that we see the extirpation of certain groups and the origination, or at least the first occurrence in the fossil record of a lot of these other groups. There's a couple different groups that survived this mass extinction event that were around for a lot of the Paleozoic, and we call these relic groups because typically most of the species for which we know that group occur much earlier in the geologic record. And there's a long sort of gap where we don't really have much or any fossil record of this group, and then they pop up again, in this case in the early Triassic, after which point we're pretty sure that they actually go extinct. Relics are interesting because, of course, it indicates that you had something probably that was around before the extinction event that happened to habitate that place or somewhere around it, and it ends up surviving, right? And so we found a relic taxon named Micropholus. This is a relatively small-bodied temnospondyl. That scale bar is 1 centimeter. And Micropholus is interesting beyond being a relic because it's only been previously found in South Africa. It's relatively terrestrial, which is in stark contrast to most of the temnospondyls that we see in the Triassic and onward. It's very small. This is also in contrast to most of the temnospondyls in the Mesozoic. And interestingly, it's commonly preserved in aggregations. So this block here preserves the remains of 4 distinct individuals, at least. And there's a number of fossils in South Africa that are also preserved like this. It's a really interesting sort of dichotomy drawn out from some of the fossils I'll show later that are typically much larger animals or much more fragmentary or that belong to aquatic animals. And we have a really reliable way of saying that Micropholus has not been found in other geographic basins that have been explored, like Australia or India or Madagascar, because it's very, very easy to identify on the basis of its ornamentation. I mentioned previously that most temnospondyls have this really distinctive kind of circular pitting ornamentation, like what you see on the right side. Micropholus has almost like the inversion of that. It actually has a bunch of 3-dimensional raised bumps on its skull. And so it's very, very easy to identify even highly fragmentary material of Micropholus. And so the fact that, relatively well-explored regions that have produced other small-bodied, other terrestrial temnospondyls, like Australia, appears to be a legitimate absence from those regions. And so it's interesting that we start to see this connection to South Africa, right? There's this Antarctic-South African connection. But there's also some other connections to some other geographic regions that Antarctica doesn't share with South Africa. And I want to talk about those in sort of the next couple of slides. The predominant group and the one to which most members that have the first fossil occurrences in the early Triassic is indicated by the sort of blue note on the phylogeny here, is this group known as stereospondyls. And so stereospondyls are really very different from a lot of these Paleozoic temnospondyls in a number of different attributes. The first is that they have a really broad global distribution. They occur from the Arctic Circle today on down to Antarctica. They're much larger than most of the Paleozoic temnospondyls that we see. They could get up to about 6 meters, 7 meters at the largest, and very frequently exceed 2 meters in body length. So we're talking the size of an alligator, for example, about as long as I am tall. But in contrast to a lot of the temnospondyls in the Paleozoic, they seem to be obligately aquatic. That is to say that they pretty much have to live in water because their skeletons are so underdeveloped that they're not really able to locomote very well on land. And whereas in the Paleozoic, specifically the Permian, we see a really good heavy mixture of terrestrial and semi-aquatic and aquatic temnospondyls. In the Mesozoic, it's 99% fully aquatic taxa. And this really represents what seems like sort of not necessarily a strategy, but the ecological space that opened up for amphibians in the wake of this mass extinction event really seems to have been freshwater ecosystems. And so at this point in time, there are no crocodiles or anything. There's really not many other tetrapods that are taking advantage of freshwater ecosystems. And so it's really the temnospondyls that end up really exploiting this wide ecological space, and they end up being the apex predators in most freshwater ecosystems, lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, what have you. They actually even make it back out to the ocean in a couple groups. And And so typically, in the fossil record in the early Triassic and other geographic regions, we see really big animals that sort of indicate that we see a really sort of different ecological strategy or characterization of what temnospondyls are doing in the wake of this mass extinction event. Antarctica is interesting because for some reason we actually seem to get most of the small ones. So this is a really, really small temnospondyl skull partial. Again, that's a 1 centimeter scale bar. And I'm pretty sure it's a new genus and species. And this group, this family is really interesting because it's only found in Australia and India, right? So again, this is one of these connections now with other geographic regions in Antarctica that's not shared with South Africa. Like Micropholus that I just showed, Lapilopsids are also relatively terrestrial. They're also small-bodied, and they're also pretty rare. And so this is, a sort of interesting sort of twist that added on a layer of complexity in addition to having this relict Micropholus only found in South Africa. But then I know we get these really rare taxa that are otherwise only found in regions more to the west or more to the east of Antarctica at that time. We also see Lydecarinids. These are a really, really common component of South African ecosystems, but they also occur not uncommonly in India, as well as a little bit in Australia. So these really have a much more cosmopolitan kind of distribution. These are also relatively terrestrial and also relatively small body. And so Antarctica seems to package a lot of these really, really small temnospondyls that we don't see very abundantly or at all in a lot of these other southern Pangaean regions. It's really interesting to think about because temnospondyls, as the sort of forerunners in amphibians, seem to have kind of gone two different directions. One is that you reach a really large body size, and that kind of allows you not to be eaten by anything. You're doing more of the eating than being eaten. But the one that seems to actually end up being most successful, and you can trace this back to their ancestors in the Permian and Carboniferous, is that it seems that really small body size is actually quite advantageous for modern amphibians. If you think about your average modern amphibian, a frog or a salamander, it probably can fit in the palm of your hands. And this is a characteristic of amphibians in general and our life today, is that they're relatively small compared to other tetrapods. There are naturally a number of disadvantages that come to being small, which is, for example, that many different organisms may be interested in eating you. But there's a number of other adaptations and sort of benefits that can come with that, such as allowing you to kind of specialize in different things and also to seek out different ecologies, for example, burrowing, that really large animals are not going to be able to tap into. And so it's interesting to see that in this post-extinction recovery interval, temnospondyls, non-modern amphibian temnospondyls, also seem to experiment with reaching really, really small body sizes from an ancestor that would have been much larger. And whether this is reflective of sort of environmental conditions constraining how many resources are available, so perhaps it's not possible to achieve a large body size in certain settings, or that there is a lot of ecological space for really small tetrapods that might, for example, specialize in insects rather than in eating other tetrapods, is a really interesting part of this narrative. And so already kind of as I, kind of highlighted throughout these last couple slides, Antarctica kind of, based on what we see from a lot of these new fossils, represents this sort of intersection of a lot of these really small-bodied, relatively terrestrial forms that occur in another geographic region, but it has a much greater diversity of these than pretty much any other geographic region that we see in terms of these small-bodied and relatively terrestrial forms. And I'm not going to go super into the nitty-gritty details of how we know that they're actually small-bodied versus just juveniles of animals that would have reached a much larger size. But there are a number of different lines of parts of the skeleton and attributes of their preservation that indicate to us that these are legitimately small-bodied animals that are probably reaching sizes comparable to what we see in modern salamanders, for example. But one of the other things, and this is really where the historical record comes into play here, is that there's been plenty of small-bodied specimens recovered in the historic record of collection in Antarctica, but their interpretation is much more suspect. And so, for example, one of these is this specimen here. It's essentially the inside part of the skull roof of what originally was thought to be a Lydecarinid. So one of these relatively small-bodied terrestrial forms that are really common in South Africa. And again, the identification of this is really based, or originally was really based on sort of circular logic, right? Lydecarinids occur really commonly in South Africa. Therefore, they should occur definitely in Antarctica. Here's something that kind of looks like a Lydecarinid. Okay, we'll call it a Lydecarinid. But sort of if you go back and look at things, first of all, a lot of the, sort of sutures and parts of the skull kind of been fabricated by the original descriptors. There's no actual evidence to support a lot of these. So they're kind of projecting what they expected the configuration of skull bones to be onto things, to kind of support that hypothesis that, well, there must be Aloidecarinid in Antarctica, so this is going to be it. And when we look at a lot of the aspects of this, it actually looks like this specimen in particular, which is a holotype of a species that's now defunct, is not actually a relatively mature but small-bodied individual. It's actually a very immature individual of probably a species that would have reached a really large size, probably a capitosaur, like what we see in the upper Fremont, that middle Triassic interval. This one is much smaller. That's, again, a 1 centimeter scale bar, whereas the one on the left, when complete, would have been about 70 centimeters long. But it's really interesting to sort of see, okay, we have evidence not only for really small-bodied organisms that legitimately remain small-bodied, but also the early life stages in which animals are inherently small, but not really that much evidence for the really large, advanced, quote-unquote, adult stages. And this is something that, and this is sort of where the middle Fremont comes in to the discussion. And so briefly, you'll recall that I mentioned that we don't really know what the age of this is because we didn't really have any fossils from this. And so it's been hard to figure out sort of how this related to other tetrapod assemblages. But in the last couple of years, new material was collected. And so we got a bunch of interesting data that end up sort of reinforcing this narrative. And so the first that kind of pops up here is that we have the reoccurrence of Micropholus. So again, that relic taxon, really distinctive kind of bumpy ornamentation on the skull roof that we otherwise only find in South Africa. So in South Africa, Micropholus occurs throughout the entire early Triassic, but definitely not after and definitely not before. And so this provides us with the most compelling line of evidence that the middle Fremont unit is early Triassic in age. And so it's an extension of the lower Fremont in that sense. And so this captures, again, the later part of this extinction recovery interval and gives us sort of a longer runway and a better idea of what the time scale that we're looking at here is for this extinction recovery event, in terms of being able to kind of get an idea of what is happening immediately after and then sort of a couple million years after. The reptiles and stuff do not really help us in terms of constraining age. And so again, this is a sort of where one of these instances where the abundance of temnospondyls in the fossil record can sometimes be the only means by which we're able to make sort of reasonable comparisons or correlations between geographic regions. But the really interesting thing, I think, is this real slew of really small-bodied specimens, some of which you can see here. You can see these are like 5 millimeter scale bars. These are really, really tiny. Here's another one that's a 1 centimeter scale bar. And when these are originally collected in the fields, the collectors, much like those historic workers in the 1970s and 1980s, assumed, it must be like an adult of a relatively small-bodied organism. But if you think about it, there's no reason why all animals only die when they're fully grown, right? We can think about pretty much any organism that exists in the wild, and mortality rates are typically higher in the early stages of development, either because they may be cannibalized by their parents, or because they're easy prey items, or simply because there's not enough resource allocation for the total number of offspring to survive. If you want to think about like a nice contemporary example, you might think about all those documentaries that, show sea turtles hatching, right? And then there's like hordes of birds just waiting to eat all these like hatchling sea turtles, right? And a lot of organisms have these strategies where they just produce a lot of offspring, knowing that a large portion of them are going to get eaten or die. And so there's actually very good reason to expect that we should actually find a lot of fossils of small individuals that are actually not mature at all. They're very immature and represent the earliest life stages of species that could end up reaching a much larger body size. But this is really interesting then, because typically what we see in most of the fossil record is that hydrodynamic filters end up filtering out a lot of the small stuff. It tends to be more fragile. It may not be as well ossified, so the bones may kind of break apart. There's all sorts of reasons why the fossil record can be really sort of skewed against small-bodied animals. It's much more interesting then when you get only small-bodied animals, because hypothetically, if larger animals were around, you would expect to find maybe larger chunks or larger individual elements, even if you don't find, for example, a complete skull. You might think, for example, that this partial skull is about 4.5 centimeters long. Okay, that could be like the size of a really large tooth of a really large temnospondyl, right? And indeed, if we look at the other tetrapods that occur in both the lower and the middle Freemouth, we do find evidence for really large tetrapods, large synapsids, some reasonably large-sized archosaurs co-occurring alongside these really small temnospondyls. But there's very, very little evidence for any large-bodied temnospondyls in these units, even though we know that we do find them in a lot of other geographic regions in southern Pangaea. And so this raises these really interesting questions of, what kind of record does Antarctica preserve? And then what does that tell us about the broader understanding of tetrapod distribution, the recovery from the extinction event, and so on. So I'm going to kind of go into the last couple of slides and wrap this up with a summary. And so if we think back on this kind of historical perspective, we started in the 70s and 80s. There's been a bunch of historic material. We have some cool stuff. It's very fragmentary. It's very hard to make heads or tails out of it. And a lot of those original identifications are not really well ground truth. And so it's very difficult to have a lot of confidence in them or to be able to say much of anything, even if you go back and look at them. There's plenty of historic fossils that we've looked at. Say, you're just not going to be able to say anything about this other than that it's a temnospondyl. And so, as a result, of really doing a lot of this revisionary work and then, going back and looking at old stuff, looking at new stuff, looking at, the entire tetrapod record, getting a better idea, we now have this much better flushed out record in terms of, okay, we can confidently say these groups occur here. These groups definitely don't occur here. We have these new occurrences here. This is how this kind of relates to these different southern Pangaean regions. And so going left to right, this is essentially showing presence-absence data for different southern Pangaean regions: Brazil, South Africa, Madagascar, India, Australia, and then Antarctica in the far right column. And so I'll just sort of highlight a couple key patterns here. Antarctica does preserve records of groups that we expect to find, groups that are really common in other geographic regions that may be very common fossils within that geographic region. And so even though some of those sort of early historical conjectures were kind of circular in nature, the hypotheses ultimately ended up being proven correct, that yes, some of these groups are really just cosmopolitanly distributed, and that indicates that they may have had some sort of physiological adaptation that gives them an advantage to sort of dispersing around in this post-extinction interval. Maybe it is, for example, sort of a thicker skin to limit water loss. This is something you see in, let's say, desert-adapted toads, for example. Or some other sort of skeletal feature that lends them that advantage. But interestingly, we also see the occurrence of really rare taxa that we don't see in most of these other adjacent regions that have been fairly well sampled. This is really interesting to think about, predominantly, especially because they tend to be relatively small-bodied and relatively terrestrial. What does that say about the Antarctic record? I didn't mention it really that much in this talk because it's still, the fossil mostly needs to be prepared. But last summer when I was going through somebody else's collection of Antarctic stuff, I found this really, really rare group, what are known as plagiasaurids. And there are maybe like at least a couple hundred different specimens of plagiasaurids from the northern hemisphere throughout the entire Triassic. But throughout the entire Triassic in the southern hemisphere, there's only 3 records. And so I just found the 4th in the LA Museum's collection. And this group is really interesting because historically they've been cited as being a pioneer species. So different lines of evidence indicate that they tend to do well in less stable habitats and seem to prefer those certain environments where there might be, for example, frequent saltwater influxes or sort of unstable oxygen conditions relative to other both other vertebrates like fish as well as to other temnospondyls. So it's really interesting to observe that they don't seem to be found very commonly in southern Pangaea, but do occur in Antarctica. And so I think to kind of pull together like these 3 points of, okay, what can we take away from the Antarctic fossil record? What do all these new data, these old evaluations, these comparisons, what do they tell us, right? So we see a really high temnospondyl diversity in the early Triassic of Antarctica, much higher than we thought, certainly in the 70s and 80s. This brings it much more in line with some of the regions that are slightly easier to prospect, such as Queensland and Australia. We have this really interesting mixture of relict and stereospondyle clades. So holdovers from the Paleozoic, as well as a lot of the new members that first show up in the fossil record in the early Triassic. If we kind of look at the finer scale taxonomy of things, what families are these in? We see this kind of unique combination, that Micropholus is only found in South Africa, but we also find it in Antarctica, that Lapalopsids are only found in Australia and India, but also in Antarctica. as well as these really cosmopolitan distributed groups like Lydecarinids. What does this mean in terms of Antarctica as the refugium? My general sense of things right now is that Australia is probably the refugium. And the reason I say this will sort of link to the third point that I'll talk about in a bit. But Australia has an even higher taxonomic diversity of temnos models, and it has the large-bodied ones that we know achieve a global distribution pretty early on in the early Triassic. And so, whether it was that, Australia is more hospitable for all life stages of a given organism, so there's no sort of need to migrate to a different region as you grow up, or that there's something about the Antarctic record that just makes it so that juveniles tend to die at a much higher rate, or that there's some sort of weird taphonomic filter. It seems that Australia is probably, at this point, the most likely source of the refugium, but that Antarctica is maybe one of the main conduits or convergence points for a lot of these different groups to end up sort of dispersing through and then kind of going out and repopulating the globe, whether that's to South Africa or to India or to Madagascar to South America. And so this last point that I sort of touched on again is really interesting to see this prevalence of small-bodied terrestrial forms and only the really small, highly immature individuals of what we are pretty sure end up being large-bodied forms. If we take the fossil record sort of at face value, which you always kind of have to do with some degree of reservation, it suggests that at least early on in these this post-extinction recovery of Antarctica, it's stable enough to support a good diversity, but it may not be so sustainable for a really long-term healthy kind of environment. And so we actually see some similar stuff in South Africa where people had historically assumed, oh, this kind of seems to be the upper size bound for this given species, whether it's Lystrosaurus, a really common synapsid, or temnospondyls, these must be the adults. But work actually shows that no, they're actually mostly immature, and it just seems like there's a really high mortality rate very early on in the life history. And so whether that's because the climate is really unstable or there's a lot of predation, other things going on, seems like that might also be the case in Antarctica. And so it might be if you're breeding, that might be the spot to go breed in and lay your eggs and then leave. But it might not be a good sort of long-term place for sort of really stable, large-body temnospondyl amphibians to survive. But with that being said, I think the ultimate takeaway is that, yeah, amphibians do end up doing really, really well in this wake of the extinction recovery interval, and that regardless of where this actual refugium is, it's very obvious that these high latitude southern Pangaean localities and regions were really quite crucial to sustaining a lot of that diversity that then ends up going back and sort of repopulating, for example, North America, which achieves a much higher diversity, but not really until the middle Triassic. The early Triassic diversity in North America is much lower than what we see elsewhere. And it's sort of classic quote, right? We're not entirely sure, what exactly all the mechanisms are for this, right? There's a lot of things that we can't directly observe in the fossil records, for example, soft tissues or other physiological adaptations. But the fossil record at least gives us a tantalizing insights and idea of like, okay, we should be looking at these directions to think about possible avenues for future research, or should we find, areas to go explore or hypotheses to kind of think about testing in terms of trying to understand, what are sort of the more specific attributes of a different taxonomic group or a certain environment that allow for tetrapods to exist and really thrive in the wake of this mass extinction event, particularly those that ended up surviving through that extinction event. With that, thanks for listening, and I will be glad to take any questions.